Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name's Alex, and I'm going to be kicking off the webinar this afternoon. I'm going to hand over to Steve in a moment. But before I do, I thought I would take a moment to just introduce NQA to those of you who aren't familiar with us. If you could hop onto the next slide, Steve.
Okay.
So we are a global certification body accredited by UCAS. We have a global presence, and our primary markets are the UK, the USA, India, and China. We're now 34 years old as a business, and we have issued more than 50,000 certificates, and we have a focus on high-tech and engineering sectors. And we're a leading CB, as you can see from these statistics, for a number of industries and standards. I won't read them all, but there are some fairly impressive stats there. One thing I would like to mention, though, which we're also quite proud of, is our Net Promoter Score, which is 70. It's measured on a scale of -100 to +100, and we're currently at the highest in the industry at 70, +70, that is. So that is something we're particularly proud of. On to the next slide, Steve. We certify across a number of sectors and industries, from quality through to aerospace, automotive, environment and energy, and most recently carbon neutrality, which we'll be hearing some more about shortly. We also offer certification for management systems that focus on health and safety, information resilience, food safety, risk management, and medical devices, amongst others. Complementary to this, if we hop onto the next slide, we offer training solutions that align with virtually all of the standards we offer certification for. So I won't go through all the standards again, but these are held virtually and in-house throughout the UK, from introductory through to advanced levels. And if you would like to take a deeper dive into any of the standards covered in this webinar, you can visit nqa.com/sustainability to view courses on energy management, environmental management, and carbon neutrality, including the next slide, which features our latest course, which is on understanding and achieving carbon neutrality. So this will give you all you need to know in order to understand and implement the standard within your organization and how to be verified carbon neutral. You can't actually click the book here link, but we will be circulating the slides, which will have a link to it, or you can access it via the URL that I mentioned, which was nqa.com/sustainability. So onwards, if we could go on to the next slide, I'm going to be handing over to our partner from Intu Veritas, Steve Linkstead, for the webinar that you've all registered and attended for, which is how PAS 2060, ISO 14001 and ISO 50001 work together in unison. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much. And yeah, so as Alex has said, I am Steve Linkstead from Intu Veritas. And Intu Veritas supply consultancy services to a number and a growing number of different industry sectors. Traditionally across the main sort of ISO standards of 9001, 14001, 2745, 50, and we're seeing a growing interest in PAS 2060 standalone, but also alongside some of those existing ISO certifications, and that's where we came to this kind of topic for this webinar from, to try to answer some of the questions that we're seeing and we're being asked along that sort of consultancy route as to what's the point of doing PAS 2060 if I've already got 14,001, or if I've already got 50,001, or the other way around. You know, we're looking at PAS 2060, why bother with an ISO standard? So hopefully we can kind of address some of those questions, and also then some of the ways that we've seen to get them to work together, so to avoid some of the duplication that inevitably occurs when you're using multiple standards, and try to use the requirements from one to answer the requirements for the other two sort of standards. Now, obviously, we're dealing with ISO 14001, so environmental management system, ISO 50001, energy management system, and PAS 2060, the standard around carbon neutrality. But there are also other synergies with the other ISO systems. So within the more modern ISO standards, Annex SL, for those of you that are aware of the way they work, effectively the same clause in one standard is pretty much the same clause in another. So what we talk about here with 14001 and 50001 to a certain extent is also appropriate across 9001 and even some bits of 27001. There are synergies within some of the documentation, even if not within some of the subject matter. So what we're going to do is we're going to look briefly at what each one of those three standards are, as they're the ones that are surrounding kind of the environment and the energy side, and then obviously onto the carbon neutrality, and then have a kind of just a quick look at how they can act together. Now, we're not going into detail on any of the standards or this kind of whole way, this holistic overview of using the three together. It is very much scratching the surface. We've already had one question about are the slides coming around afterwards, and yes, they are, and the video of the webinar will be available afterwards as well. And they'll come out from NQA, and within that communication will be the details for contacting NQA and coming through and contacting us should there be any sort of further questions on either the certification journeys or verification journeys or the implementation journeys and so on. So if we don't go into enough detail, we kind of apologize. You know, this was very much just sort of this introduction, and hopefully it will be useful to you all. So we've already said then 14001, which is kind of known, familiar to most people, is the environmental management standard. So it covers the way that our organizations can conduct our business with the intention of reducing our environmental impact. It requires demonstration of improvement, and it requires the sort of investigation, documentation of how we currently interact with the environment, and also how the environment may interact with us. Now, where that links obviously to PAS 2060 is that bit of how we interact with the environment. So we won't be touching on things like the emergency preparedness and response side of the standard, but we will be looking at how the environmental aspects and impacts and the work that we do around that can help us link in towards carbon neutrality. We'll also look a little bit at how the documentation can be slightly modified within 14001 to give that link to make it usable for PAS 2060 with actually a relatively small amount of work. And hopefully this is kind of where the interest on this webinar has come from, as to an organization that may already have or is already thinking about 14001, 50001, and how we can kind of use the two things together. Now, we can see in the green kind of summary boxes there, the environmental management system. It's ISO, it's an international standard, so it can be implemented worldwide and implemented across different divisions, different departments, different countries within a single organization. The whole aim is for improved environmental performance. So whether that's from our emissions, whether that's from our waste streams or other bits and pieces, it looks at kind of everything across our interaction with the environment. Being an international standard and being certified to that standard can help an organization increase their environmental credibility and their image. And we're also getting more and more inquiries from organizations that are being requested to go down the certification route by their by their clients or by their customers who are looking and who are requiring to have these, their vendors or their suppliers to have these certifications. Through the journey of 14,001, we need to look at legislation, regulations, and any other sort of environmental requirements, and our own methodologies and the way we interact to look at to make sure we meet those legislations, and to make sure that we look at how we can improve our own environmental footprint. And of course, if we get it right, eventually that should be looking at cost savings and so on as well. So from that point of view, that's a positive for the organisation. ISO 50001 is the energy management standard. Now, much the same as 14,001, it's an ISO standard, so internationally recognised, an international certification, and it shows that commitment to the analysis and the drive to reduction of our energy use. Now, the energy can come from any source, so this may be kind of, grid-powered electricity, mains gas, but it could also be your own generated solar or wind or hydro. And what's interesting with 14,001 and 50,001, 14,001 may give you credit, for example, from changing from a diesel fleet to an electric fleet. 50,001 won't necessarily give you credit for that, unless, which in real terms probably will happen, but unless there's an efficiency saving and actually you end up, reducing your energy amount. So what 50,001 is doing is looking at the amount of energy we use. This is quite a critical point, because right now carbon offsetting schemes and using, and we'll look at these a little bit more detail, but we're using projects worldwide to be able to buy carbon credits, to be able to buy an amount of carbon offsetting. However, that's a finite resource. So if we just continue to increase our energy requirements and keep driving it upwards and upwards and upwards, eventually we're going to, in simple terms, run out of trees to buy. So we need to actually drive to improve our energy use. And this is where 50,001 comes in, because that doesn't look at the emission side of it, doesn't look at the environmental aspect, it looks at the pure usage of energy. However, of course, the flip side of that, energy production generally also results in carbon and carbon emissions. So because of that, that will also help us with helping to reduce our carbon emissions, because we've reduced that energy usage. Like 14,001, it covers areas of legislation, regulations, and any other kind of energy related requirements, be that from customers, from clients and so on, and that covers across them as well. The standards can all help to demonstrate our conformity or our commitment to delivering things like the Paris Agreement or the government reporting requirements in whichever country you're operating, COP26 outcomes. We can use all of those to follow those kind of situations and use it for that. And yeah, a comment coming from Richard as well about the link between 50,001 and ESOS and demonstrating ESOS compliance. And yeah, absolutely. As I explained at the beginning, we're not diving into the standards too much and their individual kind of benefits. But yes, thank you for that point, Richard, and that link to ESOS. So PAS 2060 is obviously the standard then that looks for this either commitment to carbon neutrality or a declaration of carbon neutrality, depending on where we are within the cycle. So the important thing with PAS 2060 is there are multiple routes to achieving it. Now, we're obviously all sitting here on a webinar that's being hosted by an awarding body. So we're looking at having an externally verified PAS 2060. But PAS 2060 does allow for other routes, self-certification, self-verification, and so on. But if you look at the hierarchy, which is actually quoted within the standard, the sort of the gold standard, if you like, is to get this external verification, to look at what we do, to have the external audit, if you like, so that we can have those claims third-party verified, rather than us just saying, yep, we're carbon neutral, and here's the numbers. But it does allow for that path. It also gives guidance on how we're going to calculate our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we talk about carbon neutrality, and one of the reasons we talk about carbon neutrality is all of the greenhouse gases that we look at are then converted into tons of CO2 equivalent. So we look at a number of greenhouse gases, but they all have published conversion factors to take them all back to carbon. So we only kind of state and we only look for that carbon neutrality. So yes, there are a number of greenhouse gases, but carbon or carbon dioxide is by far the greatest contributor. It allows for different methodologies of analyzing and recording our data. So again, at kind of the top of the standard, if you like, is ISO 14064. Again, another ISO standard, internationally recognized, and this provides the whole guidance on what we need to collect, how we need to collect, how we need to document, whether we need to build any justifications in for any averages or any estimates, and so on. So that forms our whole reporting framework that we can then feed into PAS 2060. It's the one, as consultants, we generally advise our clients to go for, purely because it is that kind of gold standard and it fits quite nicely with other ISO standards. We look at then, having done all those calculations, gone through 14064 or the other methods, we come up with a number at the end, which is your total carbon emission for the reporting period. So it's always done, when we look past 2060, is always a historic certification, because we need the data to have been analysed to then be able to offset that carbon, so that effectively we're always offsetting last year's carbon, if you like. So the verification is valid for 12 months, but based on the previous 12 months. So we then work that through, and we can include in our carbon plans for the future. So how are we going to reduce our own carbon emissions? What other plans maybe do we have for offsetting? Are we looking at any other methods and so on about achieving a reduction in our own carbon emissions? Now, Mike, interesting question has just popped in regarding carbon neutrality versus net zero versus gross zero. You must have already seen the slides, Mike. So carbon neutrality, net zero, and gross zero. Carbon neutrality and net zero are often used interchangeably as phrases, but there is quite a significant difference. So carbon neutrality is essentially where we as an organisation we pledge to offset our emissions by funding an equivalent amount of carbon savings somewhere else in the world. Now, there are lots of carbon savings projects. So I said slightly flippantly earlier about buying some trees, but there are lots of other projects. And there are a number of organizations that kind of have these lists of these projects. So they might be things like funding hydroelectric power in some parts of the world to give them clean power, to get rid of lots of people individually running ancient diesel generators and things like that, which obviously it brings in a carbon savings. So that's where carbon neutrality comes in. We produce the carbon, then effectively we pay someone else to get rid of it, or we pay someone else to get rid of an equivalent amount of carbon. Net zero is where we actually deal with our own carbon ourselves. So effectively, we're putting no more carbon into the atmosphere than that which we're taking away. So emissions we are making directly or indirectly, we're balancing ourselves. So it's much the same idea. There is still some offsetting, but the difference is we manage the offset scheme. There are our own offsets. So examples of this may well be if we have a large amount of real estate and we decide to build a large solar farm or a large wind farm and produce our own electricity, And then if we start producing surplus electricity and being able to sell back to the grid, we can actually claim carbon credits from that, because then the green power that we're putting onto the grid is saving carbon generated electricity. So we can claim those credits back, as well as having significantly reduced our own carbon footprint in the first place. So, so we'll have less to offset anyway. So that's kind of the main difference between carbon neutrality and net zero. Now, gross zero is essentially, certainly with current technology, unachievable. It's where we emit no carbon into the atmosphere. So there's no offsetting, we just don't put anything out there in the first place. You know, a great and admirable goal, as we've said there, but currently we just can't achieve it. There are too many technologies and so on that would need to significantly change, right down to sort of power generation, water generation, transportation and so on, that would have to change significantly for us to ever reach that gross zero goal. So whilst occasionally you do hear about gross zero, at the moment it's something that you know, for most organizations, there just is not, there's just no achievable way of getting there. So I spoke about offsetting schemes. The important thing about offsetting schemes when you use them is that they are a recognized offsetting scheme that is properly documented and takes into account the amount of carbon credits that you have purchased, and essentially doesn't sell them then on to somebody else. A quick Google search through the news of sort of different carbon offsetting schemes reveals a number of cases where people have sold the same 10 acres of trees to multiple businesses, and they've all claimed the same carbon from the same trees. Doesn't work like that, and within PAS 2060 we need to justify and again sort of verify whichever carbon offset scheme we need. The carbon offset schemes themselves, when you look at them, generally also identify which of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that offsetting scheme makes. So you can see the slide there. It shows, you may not be able to read it, but again, if you do a quick Google for United Nations SDGs, you'll come up with this image. But essentially, there are 17 different key areas that those Sustainable Development Goals support, and many of the offset schemes will tell you which one or more of those that particular offset scheme supports. So if your business has a particular drive in one direction, so for example aquatic life, so SDG number 14, life below water, you could look for an offsetting scheme that meets or drives forward SDG number 14, and that then helps align your carbon offset scheme with your company's ambitions as well. And sorry, just trying to checking the questions, apologies, just I'll just park that one for a moment. Okay, so we look at scopes. So when we're talking about PAS 2060 and when we're talking about our carbon emissions, they're classified into scopes. Now, I'm sure we've all heard of scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions being spoken about. But again, quite a lot of the questions we receive are what's meant by scope 1, what's meant by scope 3, you know, and so on. Do we have to count them all? Can we discount any of them? And those sort of things. So scope 1, direct emissions, what's caused by us. So what fuel do we burn, company vehicles, power generated on site if we're running things like diesel generators and so on, they all come under scope 1 emissions. There's also a little bit in there fugitive emissions, and they cover things like leaks. So, you know, is our air conditioning leaking from our vehicles, from our offices, from our chilled water plants, those sort of things as well that might contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And again, we do account for those within scope 1. So they're things that are caused by us directly. Scope 2, energy indirect emissions, are things that are used by us. So purchased electricity, purchased steam, purchased heat, or purchased cooling. So this isn't heat that you might produce yourself from a gas furnace, for example. That would be under scope 1. This would be if you're connected to a community heat and power source, or you purchase in heat or another sort of energy source in a shared office, for example, or a shared industrial area. So that comes into scope 2. And then scope 3 are those emissions, other indirect, that are basically due to us. So things like our raw materials, the production of the raw materials, the transportation of the raw materials to our manufacturing areas, third-party distribution of our goods. So if we're using our own vehicles to distribute, comes under scope 1. If we're using a courier firm or someone else to distribute, that comes under scope 3. And when we then identify these as 1, 2, or 3, we can see the areas, and we can see our performance then within different areas of our energy or of our emissions, and we can work out where the performance gains can best be made. We do have to be careful not to double account, particularly in scope 3. So for example, if we were to use a large courier firm, who may have already decided to go for PAS 2060 themselves, then it may be that they're already accounting for all of their mileage in all of their vehicles under their own scope 1 emissions. And if that's the case, we wouldn't need to include them in our scope 3 emissions. So when we're doing this accounting of our emissions, we need to ascertain from those suppliers and distributors whether they are already accounting for their own carbon emissions, in which case we can take them out of scope for our verification and for our calculations. So back to 14,001, Environmental Management System, clause 6.1.2 requires us to look at our environmental aspects. So we identify any way in which we interact with the environment. We need to document it, and we need to document our impacts that may arise from those aspects. So things like waste disposal. Does it go to landfill? Does it go to incineration? Does it go to recycling? And those sort of things. Now, when we're doing that, it's a relatively simple step to add the next stage, if you like, in that process, which is then to look at the equivalent tons of CO2 emitted. So, for example, the government produce and there is a link within the slides, the government produce a factors table, a conversion table that gives us some national UK averages, and this is produced annually for things like tons of waste going to landfill and what the tonnage of carbon or tonnage of CO2 equivalent is for each ton of waste we go to landfill. So having already identified those aspects and impacts within 14,001, it's a relatively simple kind of process to then quantify that and start doing the conversion towards tons of CO2. And that then immediately starts feeding into PAS 2060, because that's what we need for 2060, is to have all of our emissions calculated and converted to tons of CO2 equivalent. So this is where 14,001 for our environmental aspects, our environmental impacts, can very easily start feeding into PAS 2060 and our PAS 2060 process. Likewise, 50,001, clause 6.3, we need to look at energy use, types of energy we use, and our past, present, and future energy use. For 50,001, we normally record our energy in terms of kilowatts per hour, kilowatt hours, and again, the government, and there's the link on this slide, the government conversion factors give us the numbers that we need to convert that energy use in kilowatt hours to tons of CO2 equivalent. And it will give us multiple tabs, multiple energy types, and lots of activities. So purchase of, if we can't get the data from our suppliers. It can give us things like purchase of raw steel or purchase of wood for building. And if you have a look on that government page and download the spreadsheet, if you've not seen it before, you'll see there's a huge number of different materials or energy sources and all sorts of things there, that it gives us that equivalent in tons of CO2. It also allows us for averaging things like employees commuting. So our energy use, so things like the due to us, so they're not necessarily caused by us, but due to us, our employees commuting to and from work, what cars do they drive? And we can again average those out using the conversion tables that classify cars into sort of small, medium or large. Or we can go to the next stage of that and find out exactly what every employee drives, and work out the figures from the manufacturer's figures rather than using the averages. But for a large company, that could be an enormous undertaking, and that's where this the conversion, the greenhouse gas reporting conversion factors comes in very, very useful to complete this sort of task. What this does allow us, though, in both 14,001 and 50,001, is to quantitatively record our output in terms of emissions. So 14,001, we normally stop short and we might say we want to reduce our energy use. 50,001, we might say we want to reduce our energy use by 10%, and we've got the kilowatt hour figures to back it up. So then this allows for that final next step to actually convert that into those tons of CO2 and to say, this is our carbon output right now, this is our future plans, and we can actually demonstrate the quantity of tons of CO2 that we are improving our emissions by. So then PAS 2060 requires us to document all of our greenhouse gas emissions in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent. And I've already mentioned about we've got those conversion tables so we can convert everything into these tons of CO2. Mention that there are a number of methodologies that we can use for accounting of the data, and ISO 14064-1 is kind of the most common standard, but for different industry sectors there may be more appropriate ways of doing it for your industry sector. We then document all of our carbon emissions in terms of that scope 1, 2 and 3. And the biggest part of PAS 2060 is the data collection exercise, because it's not just scope 1 caused by us. That's generally, hopefully, relatively easy because it's what we do on site. It's what our company does. Scope 2, those kind of indirect, so the amount of electricity we buy in, the amount of fuel our employees use for their commute or any sort of traveling when they're using their own cars, all of that sort of thing comes under Scope 2. But again, they're generally people that are controlled by us or areas that are kind of controlled by us through that direct purchase. Scope 3 can become a lot more challenging because that's where we're trying to get data from third parties, some of whom may be absolutely already on the ball and following this journey themselves, and may already have reams of documentation and reams of numbers that they can give you. Others of whom may have never thought about it, and sometimes then we need to rely on the government average figures and so on, whilst maybe working with those third parties to get a better level of data for future years. We look at this over, say, the past 12 months, and we come up with a total figure across all 3 scopes. And then at that point, we look at that carbon offset scheme, and we can look at purchasing those carbon credits and achieve our carbon neutrality. And that's where the likes of NQA will come in and look at the way we've done it, look at our numbers, audit our processes, and then verify our claim to be carbon neutral, and also our claim for the following year, or our pledge the following year, to be committed to maintaining or achieving carbon neutrality if this was the first year. So scroll down the questions box again. I'll come back to all of those at the end, so that's fine. So thank you. Please keep the questions coming in, and apologies, they're just in a little box at the bottom of my screen at the moment, so I just have to keep scrolling through them. So the three standards that we're speaking about then, 14,001 2015. Now obviously that's currently under review, but we suspect that the overall, well, we know the overall aim of the standard will remain the same, so we have no reason to assume that it will become any less useful to our carbon neutrality, and may actually increase its requirements towards carbon recording. So 14,001 may actually become stronger, if you like, in its terms of carbon reporting. 50,001, again, we've mentioned the same way that we can convert those kilowatt hour figures back to those tons of CO2, and that can will normally cover our scope 1 and 2 emissions. If we look at that full life cycle perspective, as required by both 14 and 50,001, then we may end up including some of those scope 3 emissions. So when we look at the raw materials or the transportation afterwards and the destruction, recycling and so on of our products when they reach end of life. Using 14064, I've already mentioned, we always recommend it to our clients because it's another ISO standard. So there's a lot of synergies. If a company already has one or more of the other ISO standards, there are already a lot of synergies within the documentation. And a lot of the documents we've already produced for 9001, 14,001, 50,001 can be extended to incorporate the 14064 requirements. So it's less work to add PAS 2060 using 14064 if you already have those ISO standards. Or if you're looking at going for one of those ISO standards as well as PAS 2060, then to do them together again brings those advantages in of doing the same thing, the same documentations kind of at the same time. It also allows for the use of a single certification body, which means that they're able to audit just one set of documents and so on. So it can reduce your overall external audit and certification requirements within the annual process and the 3-yearly cycle. So there are definite advantages to kind of trying to link them all together and to try to keep them into one CB. Our annual audits, both internally and externally, can include some of the aspects for PAS 2060, which, as I mentioned, can reduce that complexity, time and cost for the organisation. So if, for example, we're now documenting tons of CO2 within our 50,001 energy review, then that will immediately feed into PAS 2060 and is kind of acceptable using that ISO 14064 methodology as how we can account for our own energy use. And that can cover scope 1 energy and scope 2 energy. So we've already kind of linked that together. Likewise, 14,001, if we look at the other aspects, and we already have identified in our aspects and impacts register about waste streams, recycling, landfill. As I've mentioned, it's a relatively easy process then to quantify those amounts and do that conversion using the government figures into tons of CO2 equivalent. So once we have all this data, what happens? So 14,001 and 50,001, for those that are looking at embarking on the journey, you put all the standard in place, you put all the requirements in place, and then your certification body come in and they do an initial stage 1 audit. Stage 1, they basically just check that all the documentation is in place and ready for the more detailed stage 2, which is the certification audit. PAS 2060. Well, look at that. It requires an initial stage 1 pre-verification audit and then a stage 2 verification audit. And there's a difference in the terminology there because your PAS 2060 is a verification, not a certification. The awarding body or the certification body is verifying that your claims are accurate and true. Whereas for 14,001 or the other ISO standards, they're certifying your management systems to those standards. Both cases, the stage 2 results then go to for being independently verified before awarding either certification or verification. And again, that's a part of the process that your certification body will manage and will sort of take you through. ISO standards are a 3-year cycle with an annual surveillance audit and then a 3-yearly recertification audit. PAS 2060 is slightly different in that it's an annual cycle. So we verify the data for the previous year and we verify the offset against that data to make our achievement of carbon neutrality. And then we also look at the plans for the following year to make our pledge for carbon neutrality for the following 12 months. And then that happens again year on year. So there's a slight difference there. And from the perspective of how the standards sit together and how we sort of use the standards, that's the way that we sort of generally put them together for our clients. Now, that's not to say it's the only way, and it's not to say there isn't more that we can deal with during that process and so on an individual basis. But obviously, all we have time for today is that very brief kind of look through how the 3 standards work and how they can help and how they can sit together to give us that extra flexibility, if you like, across all of the standards. Now, I do hate the way that this thing gives the questions, so I do apologise because I have to scroll them to be able to read the whole questions. So, so the question around, sorry, I need to work out how I can get the whole question here. So I have expanded the screen already. So there's a question around Scope 3 emissions and do they have to be included in PAS 2060 and about all Scope 3 emissions. Now within PAS 2060 there is some allowance and within your methodology used for collection of data there is some allowance of not including emissions within the scope. So it would depend on exactly the precise circumstances, but if they are small, so if they're under 5% of your total emissions, they don't have to be included. However, to be able to demonstrate they're under 5%, you've essentially had to do the maths anyway, so there's then not much gain in not including them. And there are some other bits that you can either include just using an average figure or you can exclude, but without kind of knowing absolute critical kind of details, then that's kind of difficult. But you'd have to go through, look at your industry, look at which emissions you're trying to take out of scope and find whether that's allowable under the standard. The question about will PAS 2060 be adopted as an ISO standard or is PAS 2060 internationally recognized? PAS 2060 is gaining international recognition, but it's not an international standard as such. Essentially, it's a British standard. The PAS come out of kind of that BSI side of things, but it is they have that reputation, that international reputation and so on. So it's becoming a recognized declaration of carbon neutrality, but it's not as such an ISO standard. Will it be adopted as an ISO standard? Who knows? I suspect what we're more likely to see, and I already kind of mentioned it slightly, is perhaps the increasing of the reporting requirements within the other existing ISO standards, so within things like 14,001 and 50,001, and to bring those into line to include the carbon declaration within those. But again, this is kind of just at that point is just me saying where I suspect it might go rather than having any kind of inside information. And then another question here around 50,001 and about how will it involve with net zero being a focus. And again, I think 50,001 may well look at this net zero around energy use, but will remain 50,001 being very specific on energy. So it might bring in an evolution towards net zero of energy. So I already mentioned perhaps about generating your own wind or solar, and then offsetting, you know, feeding the grid and doing that sort of thing to give you kind of carbon credits back. So maybe the 50,001 will start looking at carbon reporting from an energy perspective. But as far as net zero is concerned, energy is a relatively in some industries, I should say, energy is a relatively small part of those emissions, depending on, you know, what is produced and how it's used and so on. So I think 50,001 will remain within that energy focus, and potentially an enhanced 14,001 may well bring in some of the other sort of carbon requirements. And I am really struggling just to get, there's a couple of questions that have scrolled off the edge of the screen and I can't get the rest of them within the screen. Here we go. Now that's an interesting question regarding installation of solar panels. So business installing solar panels, now that business who or the customer, if you like, will count towards their carbon targets. But can the installer also include it in their carbon targets? Not the same carbon. And this is where I was talking about double accounting. So potentially, if the installation business looked at the raw materials, the manufacture, the transportation, the installation, and use that side of things and offset their carbon emissions through that side of things, then that would be the installation company's kind of offsetting. As far as the actual use of the product, if the customer is going to count it towards their carbon target, it can only be counted once. So again, the installation company or the manufacturing company couldn't kind of claim any credits from there because they're already being used up by somebody else. And that's where I was talking about the verification and also using recognized offsetting projects to make sure that that sort of double accounting doesn't happen. And and then just one more question then on scope 3 emissions and that sort of the difficulties. We've already mentioned difficulty in obtaining scope 3 emissions, about, you know, is there a recommended list of items to include, or is it down to the individual company? So it is down to the individual company. However, we would expect to account for all of our scope 3 emissions, even if we have to use those averages. So there are various tables used for example, purchase of raw metal. Is it UK sourced? Is it internationally sourced? And, you know, there is an average figure that we can use for the number of tons of metal. So if we know our business is buying, I don't know, 1,000 tons of metal a year, and we know it's coming from China, then, you know, there'll be one figure that we can use for that tons of CO2 for that metal production. If it's coming from the UK, there'll be another figure. Where we do have to be careful is obviously, again, we've mentioned about double accounting, but if you think about it, if our UK steelworks is already carbon neutral themselves, and we include it in our scope 3 emissions, then actually it's an environmental benefit. We're offsetting too much carbon. So whilst it might not be a commercial benefit that we're paying too much for our offset scheme, you know, it is an environmental benefit. So we do have those kind of figures and those average figures. There isn't, if you like, a recommended list. Every business is massively different. So you know, we need to obviously just consider our main uses. But as I've mentioned, if it's a small use and you know, can be kind of looked at as under 5%, then we can take it out of scope. And there's a mention, final question then, one just coming in and just in the nick of time, talks about if waste is diverted, sorry, I can't speak now. If waste is diverted from landfill and incinerated for fuel, how would you account for this in PAS 2060? So if the waste is diverted from landfill, then from that perspective, there's no carbon figure for the waste stream, for the landfill waste stream. So we wouldn't have a carbon number, we wouldn't have a carbon emissions number for that. There may still be a transport number if it was being taken to landfill and if it's being taken somewhere else for incineration. And then we look at, okay, so the incineration process itself, again, there are figures available for a lot of materials and so on about incineration and carbon emissions from incineration. So we can get, you know, if we know that 10 tons of waste is being incinerated, we've got the carbon figure for that. Now, if we're then using that for fuel, for heat, or for generating steam or other bits and pieces, then that would be removed then from the amount of energy that we purchase in to be able to offset it in either scope 1 or scope 3. So the incineration for fuel, basically that would be a burning of a raw material, because at that point the waste becomes a raw material. So that waste would be just the same as if we fired gas to run a steam turbine or you know, a boiler to create steam. So it's just the numbers are different and those conversion factors are different. So it would be removed from the waste stream. The numbers will be removed from that sort of the waste stream carbon emissions. The transport emissions may, as I say, may still be there, and then it would then contribute to, yes, there's obviously some carbon emission from the incineration, but that equally would be offset then by the purchase of third-party produced electricity or heat or steam. So hopefully that kind of answers that question. NQA, as already mentioned, will be sending out the slides and other bits and pieces after this to everyone that's registered to attend. Thank you for kind of those questions coming in. That's been you know, really useful and a good sort of range of different questions there. It's certainly an area that we're seeing an increase in interest from a number of industry sectors, and we are hearing that there are a number of large industry sectors that are looking to start requiring declarations from some of their suppliers or otherwise. So you know, we may get more interest from that side of things, you know, internationally as well. So just to say sort of thank you from me. My contact details are there. Any questions regarding your kind of implementation journey and so on, we'd be more than happy to kind of have that conversation. Obviously, any questions from a certification process, an auditing process and so on, then please direct them back through to NQA. And thank you all very much for your time this afternoon.